The hum of the bustling airport terminal was interrupted by the occasional announcement over the PA system, calling passengers to board their flights. People moved with purpose, pulling suitcases, clutching passports, and glancing at their watches. Among the sea of travelers, one man stood out, not for his appearance, but for his presence. Tall, with slightly disheveled hair and a calm demeanor, he carried himself with an air of quiet humility that made him seem almost out of place in the hurried chaos. That man was Keanu Reeves. Keanu was dressed simply, in a plain black jacket and jeans, his travel-worn backpack slung over one shoulder. He didn't seek attention, and most people rushing past him were too absorbed in their own worlds to notice. But for those who did, there was a flicker of recognition, quickly followed by hushed whispers and the occasional discreet pointing. He acknowledged none of it, his focus seemingly on finding his gate. To him, this was just another journey, another plane ride to get him from one destination to the next. As boarding for the first-class cabin began, Keanu quietly stepped into the line. He handed over his ticket with a polite smile to the attendant, who stammered slightly as she greeted him. He nodded graciously, then moved forward, disappearing down the jet bridge. His calmness was a stark contrast to the flurry of emotions his presence seemed to evoke in others. Meanwhile, another figure entered the scene. He was a sharply dressed man in his mid-40s, wearing a tailored suit that screamed wealth and importance. His polished leather shoes clicked loudly against the terminal floor, and his air of confidence bordered on arrogance. Let's call him Mr. Dalton. With a designer briefcase in one hand and a smartphone in the other, he walked toward the gate with an attitude that suggested he owned the place. He barely glanced at the attendant as he handed over his ticket, his focus entirely on whatever deal he was negotiating over the phone. Moments later, the two men found themselves seated in the same row. Keanu had taken the window seat, already settled in with a book in his hands. Mr. Dalton, who had the aisle seat, immediately took note of his travel companion. At first, there was no sign of recognition. To Mr. Dalton, Keanu was just another passenger. But as he settled into his seat and stole a glance at the man beside him, a flicker of realization dawned. His lips curled into a smirk. "Well, this is interesting," Mr. Dalton said, his voice dripping with a mix of amusement and condescension. Keanu looked up from his book, his expression neutral but polite. "Interesting?" Keanu asked, his tone calm and unassuming. "Yeah, I thought first class was reserved for, important people," Mr. Dalton replied, leaning back in his seat. "Not Hollywood burnouts." The words hung in the air, sharp and cutting. Several passengers nearby turned their heads, their curiosity piqued. Keanu's expression didn't change. He simply closed his book, placed it on his lap, and looked at Mr. Dalton. "I'm sorry if my presence offends you," Keanu said, his voice steady. "I'm just here to travel, like everyone else." "Offend me?" Mr. Dalton chuckled. "Not quite. I'm just surprised they let someone like you in first class. I mean, aren't you supposed to be some washed-up actor? Or has your career hit rock bottom, and now you're clinging to the little fame you have left?" The tension in the cabin was palpable. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of how to react. Some recognized Keanu and looked appalled by Mr. Dalton's words. Others, who hadn't yet placed him, simply watched in awkward silence, sensing that this interaction was escalating into something uncomfortable. Keanu didn't flinch. He didn't fire back or rise to the bait. Instead, he took a deep breath, his composure unshaken. "I'm sorry you feel that way," he said simply, "but I'm not here to cause trouble." Mr. Dalton scoffed, shaking his head. "Typical. No backbone. Just like the characters you play. Always the same stoic, silent type. You'd think someone who's been in the industry as long as you have would have learned to branch out by now." Before Keanu could respond, a flight attendant approached. Her demeanor was professional, but the tension in her smile revealed that she'd heard enough of the exchange to know it was becoming a problem. "Gentlemen, is everything all right here?" she asked, her eyes darting between the two men. "Oh, everything's fine," Mr. Dalton said, waving her off. "Just having a friendly chat with my seatmate here." Keanu offered the flight attendant a reassuring nod. "It's fine," he said. "No issues." Reluctantly, the flight attendant stepped away, though she cast a wary glance over her shoulder as she walked back down the aisle. The cabin returned to its low murmur of conversations and the rustling of carry-on bags being stowed away. Mr. Dalton leaned closer to Keanu, lowering his voice but keeping the same smug tone. "You see, that's the problem with people like you. You think you're so special just because a few people recognize your face. But in the real world, you're nothing. Just another has been trying to stay relevant." Keanu met his gaze, his expression unreadable. For a moment, it seemed as though he might respond, but instead, he leaned back in his seat and returned to his book. His silence was louder than any words he could have spoken, and it only seemed to irritate Mr. Dalton further. The flight began to taxi to the runway, and the cabin lights dimmed. As the plane took off, the passengers settled in for the journey ahead. But for those seated nearby, the tension between Keanu and Mr. Dalton lingered like an unspoken storm. Little did Mr. Dalton know, his assumptions about his seatmate were about to be challenged in a way he could never have anticipated. The truth, when it finally came to light, would leave him, and everyone else, utterly speechless. The flight was now cruising at 35,000 feet. The cabin lights dimmed to a soft glow, and the hum of the engines filled the air. Passengers had settled into their routines, some scrolling through their phones, others watching movies or dozing off. Keanu remained calm, immersed in his book, his face illuminated by the small reading light. He exuded an air of quiet self-possession that contrasted sharply with Mr. Dalton's restless energy. Mr. Dalton, unable to let the matter rest, occasionally shot glances at Keanu, his irritation bubbling just beneath the surface. He was a man who thrived on control and dominance, and Keanu's unshakable composure only fueled his frustration. For someone like Mr. Dalton, who valued status and appearances above all else, the idea of a quiet, humble figure like Keanu occupying the same space and commanding more respect without trying was unbearable. A few rows back, a young woman named Claire watched the interaction with growing curiosity. She had recognized Keanu almost immediately when he boarded. Unlike most celebrities, he seemed approachable, even kind, and the way he handled Mr. Dalton's antagonism had only solidified that impression. Claire, a journalist for an online magazine, had been traveling to cover a human interest story in another city. But now she found herself wondering if a story worth telling was unfolding right in front of her. She discreetly pulled out her notebook, jotting down a few observations. While she had no intention of intruding, something about the tension between the two men intrigued her. It wasn't just the clash of personalities. It was the unspoken layers beneath their interaction. Why was Mr. Dalton so intent on provoking Keanu? And why was Keanu so unbothered by it? As the flight attendants began serving meals, Mr. Dalton decided to make another move. He leaned forward, his voice carrying just enough to ensure the surrounding passengers could hear. "So Keanu," he said, drawing out the name as if tasting it. "What's it like pretending to be someone important for a living?" Keanu looked up, his expression calm, but with a hint of wariness. "I'd say it's a lot like life," he replied, his voice steady. "We're all trying to play our parts the best we can." The answer was so simple, yet so profound, that it caught Mr. Dalton off guard. For a moment, he seemed unsure of how to respond. But then he laughed, a sharp, derisive sound. "Spoken like a true philosopher," he said, shaking his head. "You really think that's going to impress anyone?" "I'm not trying to impress anyone," Keanu said quietly, returning to his book. The conversation might have ended there, but Mr. Dalton wasn't ready to let it go. His pride demanded a win, and he wasn't about to back down. "You know, I've worked hard to get where I am," Mr. Dalton said, his voice rising slightly. Nothing was handed to me. Everything I have I earned. Can you say the same? Keanu's eyes flicked up again, but this time there was a flicker of something else in his gaze. Not anger, but a depth of emotion that suggested he had heard such accusations before. Everyone has their own path, he said. Yours is yours. Mine is mine. There's no need to compare. Mr. Dalton opened his mouth to retort, but before he could, the flight attendant returned, interrupting their exchange. Sir, she said to Mr. Dalton, her tone firm but polite. If you need anything, please let us know. Otherwise, I'd appreciate it if you could keep your voice down. Some passengers are trying to rest. Mr. Dalton's face flushed, but he managed a tight smile. Of course, he said, leaning back in his seat. The interruption seemed to deflate him, at least temporarily. Keanu, meanwhile, offered the flight attendant a small nod of thanks before returning to his reading. As the hours passed, the cabin grew quieter. Most of the passengers had fallen asleep, and the faint glow of the in-flight screens cast soft shadows across the rows. Claire, however, remained awake, her thoughts swirling. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Keanu's story than met the eye. She remembered reading about his philanthropic efforts, his reputation for kindness and humility. He wasn't just an actor. He was a person who had faced incredible loss and still managed to carry himself with grace. She glanced at Mr. Dalton, who had finally stopped fidgeting and appeared to be asleep. His earlier aggression now seemed almost pitiable, a mask for some deeper insecurity. Claire wondered what had driven him to behave that way. Was it jealousy, a need to prove himself, or something else entirely? The flight continued in relative peace, but the undercurrent of tension lingered. Claire felt it, and she suspected Keanu did too. He might have appeared unaffected, but there was a weight in his eyes that suggested otherwise. She resolved to speak to him after the flight, if only to express her admiration for how he had handled the situation. But as the plane began its descent, the true catalyst for the story revealed itself. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing that they would be landing shortly. Passengers stirred, stretching and preparing for arrival. Just as the wheels touched down, an older woman seated nearby stood up abruptly, clutching her chest. Panic rippled through the cabin as the woman gasped for air, her face pale. The flight attendants rushed to her side, calling for medical assistance. It was in this moment of crisis that the true nature of those on board, including Keanu and Mr. Dalton, would be put to the test, and what happened next would change everything. Chaos erupted in the cabin as passengers realized the older woman was in distress. Flight attendants worked quickly, but it was clear that they needed medical expertise. "Is there a doctor on board?" one of them called out urgently. For a brief moment, there was silence. Then, to everyone's surprise, Mr. Dalton shot up from his seat. His earlier smugness was gone, replaced by a sense of urgency and competence. "I'm a doctor," he said, moving toward the woman without hesitation. The passengers watched in stunned silence as Mr. Dalton took charge. He knelt beside the woman, checking her pulse and speaking to her in a calm, reassuring tone. He asked for a medical kit and worked with the flight attendants to stabilize her until the plane could reach the gate and paramedics could take over. For those who had witnessed his earlier behavior, this was an unexpected transformation. Keanu watched quietly from his seat, his expression thoughtful. It was a reminder that people are often more complex than they appear, their actions shaped by unseen struggles and layers. When Mr. Dalton finally returned to his seat, he looked drained but composed. He had avoided eye contact with Keanu, as though embarrassed by his earlier behavior. The plane reached the gate, and the woman was escorted off by paramedics, her condition stable thanks to Mr. Dalton's intervention. Passengers murmured among themselves, some praising his quick thinking, others still processing the shift in dynamics. Claire, the journalist, scribbled furiously in her notebook, her mind racing with how to frame the story she had just witnessed. As passengers began to disembark, Keanu stood and waited until the aisle cleared. He turned to Mr. Dalton, who was gathering his things. "You did good back there," Keanu said, his tone sincere. Mr. Dalton looked up, his face a mixture of surprise and gratitude. "Thanks," he said, his voice quieter than before. He hesitated, then added, I'm sorry about earlier. I shouldn't have said those things. I guess I've got my own issues I'm working through." Keanu nodded, his expression kind. "We all do," he said. "Take care of yourself." With that, he slung his backpack over his shoulder and walked down the aisle, blending into the crowd of passengers. Claire followed, feeling a deep respect for how Keanu had handled everything with grace and humility. As she exited the plane, she realized the story wasn't just about the confrontation or even the medical emergency. It was about human connection, redemption, and the unexpected ways people reveal who they truly are. In the terminal, Claire caught sight of Keanu standing by the baggage claim, quietly helping an elderly woman retrieve her suitcase. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes about the kind of person he was. She felt a sense of clarity about how she would write her article. This wasn't just a story about a celebrity or a contentious flight. It was a reminder that kindness, patience, and understanding could bridge even the widest divides. As she walked away, she couldn't help but smile. The experience had been unexpected, but it left her with a renewed faith in people. And as for Mr. Dalton, who had saved her life and faced his own shortcomings, she hoped he'd found a little of that faith too. In the end, it wasn't about winning or losing. It was about growth and the small moments that remind us of our shared humanity.